Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel, where today we'll be having a look at Michael Masi's time as F1 race director from the start of the 2019 season to the end of 2021. Before we get into it, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below. It really does help out the channel and is much appreciated. Now, let's get started. I'd like to begin with Charlie Whiting, who was the F1 race director up until he sadly passed away days before the 2019 Australian Grand Prix. Now, Whiting began his Formula 1 career in 1977 with the Hesketh F1 team, eventually working his way up to being chief mechanic for Brabham and helping Nelson Piquet win Drivers' Championships in 1981 and 1983. Fast forward to 1990 and he was appointed technical delegate to Formula 1 before eventually encapsulating the roles of race starter and race director. Even before becoming F1 director, he had over 20 years experience in the sport. During his time as race director, he wasn't perfect but did play a major role in big safety improvements to the sport, including the introduction of the survival cell, hands device and most recently the halo. When he passed away, aged 66, he had amassed over 40 years of Formula 1 experience. Compare this to Michael Masi, who before being appointed as the F1 race director had spent time with Australian supercars, but only one season as the Formula 2 and Formula 3 deputy race director, as well as deputy to Charlie Whiting. Obviously, nobody could have predicted Charlie Whiting's tragic passing, and at the time Michael Masi was probably the logical choice as successor, but was still very inexperienced when it came to Formula 1. Now, in 2019, Masi stepped in and generally did an alright job. There aren't any big controversies that come to mind, and as such, in 2020, he was officially given the job full time. It's important to remember that the race director is not one of the stewards and is not involved with the decisions they make. Instead, the overall job of the race director during a race weekend is to ensure the safe running of track activities. 2020 is where we started to see issues arise with Masi in charge, and more specifically the question of safety would be a big issue that fans had before everything unravelled at the end of the 2021 season. For me, the first big incident which didn't actually get talked about too much was that there didn't appear to be any repercussions for Charles Leclerc driving 2 laps of the 2020 Spanish Grand Prix with his seatbelts undone. While there's nothing Masi can do in the moment to stop something like that happening, he should have at least done something afterwards, as a driver without their seatbelt is probably the most dangerous thing they can do with regards to their own safety. In Mugello a few races later, Masi came under criticism from drivers including Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. This was for, in their opinion, turning off the safety car lights and bringing the safety car in too late. According to Bottas, this meant he couldn't build that big of a gap to the safety car, which was a contributing factor into the massive crash at the restart. At Imola later that season, Masi came under heavy criticism for allowing cars to unlap themselves while marshals were still on the track clearing debris. This led to a scary moment where Lance Stroll, who was racing around the track trying to catch up to the back of the pack, came very close to hitting the marshals. This for me was Masi's first unforgivable mistake. While some situations require split-second decisions, he had time to keep the situation safe and fairly straightforward procedure to follow. As a result of this incident, Formula 1 said they were prepared to extend safety car periods in order to avoid a repeat incident, but there should never have been an incident in the first place. In the very next race in Turkey, he made another decision that was widely criticised. At the end of Q1, Nicholas Latifi got stuck in the gravel, which meant a recovery vehicle had to be brought onto the track in order to recover the car. This is all good so far, but then at the start of Q2, Masi allowed the session to begin with the vehicle still out on track recovering the stranded Williams. Masi even said that he was more than comfortable with the decision given that he had been assured it would be clear in time. This incident was even more controversial given that in 2014 in Suzuka, Jules Bianchi was killed after he collided with the recovery vehicle in wet conditions. After the qualifying session, Sebastian Vettel said there was zero tolerance for the mistake, and I have to agree with him. In the very next race in Bahrain, his control of the circuit was called into question, when a marshal ran across the track in front of Lando Norris to put out a fire at the back of Sergio Perez's car. While there was some understanding for the marshal's actions, given earlier in the same race Romain Grosjean had his horror crash and this was still probably on his mind, the race director should have control of the marshals at all times. And so while not specifically his fault, a part of the blame has to go to Masi in this case. So 2020 wasn't a good year for him, and the big concerns were that the majority of his bad decisions were safety related. Even at the end of the 2022 season, a number of people were calling for him to be replaced. Moving on to 2021, and this is where things really started to unravel, with heavy criticism throughout the entire season. This began with the very first race of the season in Bahrain and the track limits drama that saw Lewis Hamilton running wide at turn 4 a total of 29 times. The confusion came where stewards initially said they wouldn't be penalising running wide during the race, despite lap times being deleted through all sessions up to that point. Then, just after halfway through the race, when Red Bull radioed to tell Masi of Hamilton going wide, he informed the Mercedes team that Hamilton needed to stop doing so, which gave the impression to most people that he was changing the rules mid-race. The situation was made even more confusing when on lap 53, Max Verstappen overtook Hamilton round the outside of turn 4, but had all four wheels off the track and so was told to give the position back. This overall indecisiveness and lack of control was a bad start to the year, and would turn out to be a recurring theme throughout the season. Later in the season in Baku, we saw his first major safety blunders of the season, after Lance Stroll and Max Verstappen both had big crashes due to tyre failures on the main straight. For both incidents, it was obvious straight away that the safety car was needed, but in the case of Lance Stroll, it took over 30 seconds to call a safety car, and with Verstappen, it was worse at over a minute, with Charles Leclerc over team radio saying it's a joke after being told by his race engineer that they were still racing. This was quite shocking, and I remember at the time wondering to myself just what was going on. The next big talking point was at Silverstone, where obviously the big event was the incident between Verstappen and Hamilton at Copse. Not so much anything to do with the safety, such as calling the safety car and the eventual red flag, but more to do so with the back and forth conversation between Masi and the two teams. We had Toto Wolff famously telling Masi he sent him an email of the two cars' positioning and the relevant regulations, and then had Christian Horner on the radio lecturing him about how you don't stick a wheel up the inside of Copse. This back and forth showed how little control Masi had over the team principals, and that it got to the point where they thought it was okay to tell him how to handle the situation. It wasn't long before he was called into question again when 2 races later at Spa he came under fire for failing to red flag qualifying in extreme wet conditions. This led to Lando Norris having a big crash through Eau Rouge, which given the conditions was fairly inevitable. And the decision looked even worse given that before Norris's accident George Russell had complained of aquaplaning in a straight line, and Sebastian Vettel was on the radio complaining that the session should be red flagged. Overall, this was an incident that could have definitely been avoided, but Masi chose not to err on the side of caution, which given his role is definitely questionable. Moving on to Russia, and track limits became a major talking point once again. This was after Fernando Alonso at the race start decided to not try and make turn 2, instead heading straight for the rejoining bollard in an attempt to gain time. This came after Alonso had stated his frustration at the lack of enforcement of track limits during the season. While this individual moment wasn't specifically Masi's fault, it did come as a consequence of not being strict and on top of track limits throughout the season. If he had been consistent with his decisions rather than changing between the white line, the curb or the gravel, then it wouldn't have become such an issue. Now for the final 2 races of the season in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, and this is where things really started to unravel. It all started when Mick Schumacher crashed during the race. A safety car was initially called and some of the cars pitted, most notably the 2 Mercedes drivers at the front of the race. It wasn't until after the pit stops that a red flag was called, the reason being to fix the barrier, which was understandable, but waiting to do so really hurt the races of a number of cars such as Lando Norris, who dropped from 6th all the way down to 14th. Things then really got interesting when after the restart and subsequent red flag, the whole world heard the radio conversation between Masi and Red Bull, where he was effectively negotiating the start position for Verstappen. This was after Max cut turn 1 and was deemed to have gained a lasting advantage. This negotiation was something F1 fans had never seen before, and while potentially common as we've only recently had the FIA team radio, it did give the sense that Masi wasn't sure what he was doing, and didn't really have the confidence to just enforce his own decision. Later in the race, after a similar incident had Verstappen cutting turn 1 again, he decided to tell Max to give the place back to Lewis. The confusion came when he told Red Bull what was happening before Mercedes, which, while not the only cause of the subsequent incident, was definitely a contributing factor. The whole brake checking incident could be a video in itself, but overall summed up how poorly the race had been managed. Now on to the final race in Abu Dhabi, which by far caused the most controversy I've ever seen in my time watching F1. After Nicholas Latifi crashed on lap 53, a full safety car was called. This backed the pack up fully and left a number of lap cars between Hamilton and Verstappen. Initially on lap 56, lap cars were told they would not be allowed to overtake. Then on the penultimate lap, lap 57, it was announced that lap cars could unlap themselves, but only those cars in between Hamilton and Verstappen. The safety car was then immediately called into the pits on that lap. This could very well be a whole video, and I would recommend watching Chamber's breakdown if you haven't already. But in summary, the decisions made definitely interpreted the regulations in a way that we hadn't seen before, and also called into question the amount of power that the race director had, given he seemed to be able to override certain regulations just based on his role. Ultimately, the entire sequence was confusing and to me gave the impression Masi was out of his depth, and at time of recording, the FIA are currently investigating the events of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. So in summary, over 3 seasons in charge, Masi's decision making and regard for safety only seem to have gotten worse, and there have been multiple occasions where his decisions have led to some very scary situations, and that's only on the safety side of things. This past season, we've also seen how he's been inconsistent and ultimately not firm enough when it comes to dealing with teams. Combine that with the handling of the final 2 races, and in my opinion, it's time to go. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and click the subscribe button for more F1 related content. Please leave any feedback, suggestions or opinions in the comments down below, and until next time, take care.